Okay, so advanced filmmaking techniques. Mr. Hockett helped me out a lot with this, but then there's also a book that I used heavily called Cinematographic Storytelling, and pulled a lot of examples from that. One film that I have wrestled with showing you this semester is Citizen Kane. Citizen Kane, over the years, has been ranked routinely #1 in the AFI, and I love the movie. I think it's a very interesting movie. Orson Welles is the guy who wrote it, and there's a fascinating history behind it. But it's also, I talked to my wife about this, who usually has a pretty good gauge, and she's like, I watched that in high school, and I just thought it was kind of boring. So we're not watching Citizen Kane, unless you guys overall really, really want to. But in this section, though, I'm going to show you a number of scenes from Citizen Kane, because one of the reasons why it's considered so great is because it was really at the forefront at a lot of filmmaking techniques that had not really been used extensively or even at all up to that time. So you'll get a little taste of what Citizen Kane was like. You've actually already seen one clip from Citizen Kane. You guys know what it was? Rosebud. That extreme close-up of the mouth saying Rosebud, that is actually right at the beginning of the film. And actually, the whole film, everybody's asking who Rosebud was. And it actually creates a little bit of interest and intrigue. But we're going to go a little bit further with that. Before I get into that, what is directing? I found this quote. That's Alfred Hitchcock. All right. What is directing? All right. A master craftsman knows how to create a specific shot, but a director knows why. Right? I've asked you that question a lot, right? Why? Why is that shot meaningful? Or why do you feel that way about a shot? The first part of the director's job is knowing what the audience should be feeling and when. Okay? The second part is harnessing the tools to get them there. So I really like that quote because I think it really made a little bit clear, at least to me, what directing really is like. Like, you can use a bunch of different cool, innovative shots, but if you're not directing that properly, it's not going to evoke the emotion from your audience that you want them to feel. Okay, so I wanted to. Does that make sense? What that quote is saying? So again, I'm going to show you a lot of different tools. When you go to watch a movie, your question is, does the director use those tools effectively to get the kind of feeling from the audience that he would want to get? Obviously, Alfred Hitchcock is one of the most famous directors of all time, and he is really considered one of the masters in terms of using technique to harness emotion, or to evoke emotion from an audience. And of course, his primary emotion that he was trying to evoke from his audience was suspense and horror. Okay, which he was very good at doing that, and not in a like we're just going to throw blood all over the walls sort of way. Very lots of interesting techniques that he used, and we'll look at a couple of the techniques today. So. And actually, there's a movie that just came out about him. Has anyone seen that? It's like a biography. I want to see it sometime. So, direction. Now, direction, again, oh, I always hate it when I do that. Oh, for the love. Anyway, okay. So, direction. Using space is something that a director tends to do. And I think when you see Singing in the Rain, you're going to see elements of this, okay, as we watch the movie. Now, this is from Citizen Kane. This is actually right at the beginning. How do you think space is being used in this picture? Remember, space, this goes, we're starting to get to like x-axis, y-axis, z-axis, all that kind of stuff. How is space being used here? Huh? No, say that again. You can see everyone, right, in the shot. Very good. And it's a crowded shot in a sense, right? There's also framing being used here. Go ahead, David. You're going to say something.
I was going to say there's the two people in the foreground and one guy in the middle.
Okay, way back, which is actually Charles Kane, who's the main character, is a little boy. And what they are doing is they're discussing his future, because basically Charles Kane is about to go with him as the family is being forced to give him up in some ways. So, and he's just gleefully playing in the background, which has an interesting effect on, like, if you're really bad for this child who's kind of unknowingly, whose fate is unknowingly being decided by these dominant people in the foreground, right? Look, he's super tiny. These people are really big. It's like he has no control over what's happening in his life, which is a huge sort of feeling, even though it might be subtle from the director, that gives the audience. Okay, so x-axis. We had talked about x-axis before. What was it? For those of you who remember who understood it, yes.
Since in general, when we read like left to right, in general we trust the person on the left more than the right. So the good guy on the left and the bad guy on the right.
Okay, all right, good. All right, so yeah, typically the bad guy is going to be coming right to left. The good guy is going to be coming from left to right, typically. Now this is from Strangers on the Train, and this is an Alfred Hitchcock movie. All right, and so in this movie, you have two characters. One is clearly the evil bad guy, and the other guy is kind of like the good guy. He's a bit of a victim in the situation. But this is like the opening scene to the movie. So this is x-axis. I wish I had a pair of those. All right, so yeah, that's what Hitchcock was trying to hope you were going to say at the end there. Okay, so how is x-axis used here? I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, well, just like one guy's coming from the left.
Right, who's coming from the left consistently? Black shoed guy, right? Okay, guy from the right, cool wingtip shoes. Two-tone. I've always looked for it. I wanted to buy, but can never find them my size because I wear size 14. Okay, good. All right, so then what happens at the end of the scene? They literally collide. Like they're literally on this collision course. Okay, and from that moment forward, those two are entangled in this web of what ends up being murder and revenge and payback and all sorts of things. So Hitchcock sets up both overtly and actually very subvertly or subliminally, if you will, that these two, that one is the bad guy, one is the good guy. And actually, too, in this scene, Hitchcock uses another axis called y-axis. Okay, more of the upward direction. All right, and if you watch this is the example right here. Okay, so the train is traveling right on the straight and narrow, and now it's getting diverted off to the right. Like it's these subtle abnormalities, like, okay, we were supposed to be going one direction, now we're headed off on a different track, which again happens to the protagonist in the film. Because the antagonist comes and clearly steers him off in a pretty terrible direction. Okay, so the use of space like that, okay, sets up some pretty interesting psychological impact for the audience that sometimes we don't even realize, but is very purposeful in how it's drawn up. Questions on that? Does that make sense, what I'm saying? Okay. Next technique is z-axis. Okay. And the last one is considered y-axis because the trains are going, the train tracks are basically going from the bottom to the screen and they almost reach the top. Okay, this is z-axis, which is more depth of field. Okay, Welcome back. All right. This is from Citizen Kane. Right? And Charles Kane is in the background. And again, part of this story is that his mother is forced to give him up, and he gives a lot of money. A lot of money is actually bestowed to Charles Kane. All right? And the guy on the left here is supposed to oversee his estate for him as a child growing up. All right? In this scene, however, Charles Kane is on the verge of losing a lot of money. All right? It's right during the Great Depression. So here we go.
Don't you think it's rather unwise to continue this philanthropic enterprise? This empire that's costing you $1 million a year?
The empire that's costing him $1 million a year, that's Charles Kane on the right, or on the left, excuse me. All right? Basically, he starts a newspaper, all right, and is losing $1 million a year on this newspaper because he's so passionate about being in the newspaper industry. Not Pulitzer. You guys remember William Randolph Hearst from U.S. History, The Yellow Press? Okay, so this movie, he's kind of impersonating, or it's a bit of a commentary on his life. So hence the newspaper. But basically, the guy on the right is saying, "Are you crazy? You're losing $1 million a year on this newspaper."
Right, Mr. Thatcher. I did lose $1 million last year. I expect to lose $1 million this year. I expect to lose $1 million next year. You know, Mr. Thatcher, at the rate of $1 million a year, I'll have to close this place in 60 years.
With respect to the said newspapers, the said Charles Foster Kane hereby relinquishes all control thereof, and of the syndicates pertaining thereto, and any and all other newspaper, press, and publishing properties of any kind whatsoever, and agrees to abandon all claim
Which
thereto.
means we're bust. All right.
Well, out of cash.
All right, Mr. Bernstein. I read it, Mr. Thatcher. Let me sign it, and I'll go home.
Too old to call me Mr. Thatcher, Charles.
You're too old to be called anything else. You were always too old.
In consideration thereof, Thatcher and Company agrees to pay to Charles Foster Kane as long as
My
he lives.
allowance.
The sum of
Continue to maintain over your newspapers a large measure of control. Measure of control? And shall seek your advice. This depression, temporary. There's always the chance that you'll die richer than I will.
It's a cinch I'll die richer than I was born.
We never lost as much as we made.
Yes, but you're met.
Okay, so how is z-axis used? Let's listen to it one more time. Listen to the dialogue as well. Yep. By the way, I think that's interesting how he reveals. Basically, remember, that guy on the left is Kane's guardian. Like, he has been in charge of Kane's finances.
All claim
Which
thereto.
means we're bust. All right.
Well, out of cash.
All right, Mr. Bernstein. I read it, Mr. Thatcher. Let me sign it, and I'll go home.
Too old to call me Mr. Thatcher, Charles.
You're too old to be called anything else. You were always too old.
In consideration thereof, Thatcher and Company agrees to pay to Charles Foster Kane as long as
My
he lives.
allowance.
The sum of
Continue to maintain over your newspapers a large measure of control. Measure of control? And shall seek your advice. This depression, temporary.
So how is z-axis used in conjunction with the dialogue?
Is it when he's like walking away and then coming back?
Yes, that is the use of z-axis. So again, that's a technique, right? Which, who cares? He's going to the back of the room and to the front of the room. Okay, if there's no purpose behind that, that is poor directing. You can hardly see him back there.
He's like
Why would you send him back there? So there is definitely, when it's in conjunction with the screenwriting, it makes a lot of sense and even has been considered by some critics brilliant. I'm going to roll it one more time.
I don't really get what they're saying. Are they...
Yeah, well, listen. Okay, now remember, what would you... No, but listen more carefully. What's happening here? What did I say is happening here? Generally speaking, what historical event is going on at this time? Thank you very much. What typically happens during the Great Depression? People lose money or on the verge of their businesses, or lose their businesses. Okay? So, Cain is in the midst of losing his business, at least to some degree. Now remember, that guy is who? His guardian. He always has been, going back to that picture. That is the same guy right there. Are you with me? Okay, so he has always been in charge of until, of course, he's turned 18 or whatever and is allowed to control his own money. Going back.
Don't you think it's wrong?
All right, so he is reading off, the guy in the very foreground is reading off the terms of the bankruptcy, if you will. When people go bankrupt, they don't typically have all of their money taken from them. They still have some sort of income or some sort of way to survive, because the government doesn't really want, if someone to go bankrupt, to not be able to do anything that doesn't help society as a whole. All right, so let's try one more time.
Other newspaper, press, and publishing properties of any kind whatsoever. And
I'm sorry, I need to back it up here for a second.
Okay. Respect to the said newspapers, the said Charles Foster Kane hereby relinquishes all control thereof. And
what is he relinquishing control of? His newspapers.
The syndicates pertaining thereto, and any and all other newspaper, press, and publishing properties of any kind whatsoever.
So basically anything connected to that, all right, he's losing control of that.
And agrees to,
according to that agreement that's on that paper.
Abandon all claim.
Which means we're bust. All right.
Well,
right, so Cain just simplifies it. We're bust. All right.
out of cash.
All right, Mr. Bernstein. I read it, Mr. Thatcher. Let me sign it, and I'll go home.
Too old to call me Mr. Thatcher, Charles.
You're too old to be called anything else. You were always too old.
In consideration thereof, Thatcher and Company agrees to pay to Charles Foster Kane as long as
My
he lives.
allowance.
What did he just say? What did Cain just say? My allowance.
I continue to maintain over your newspapers a large measure of control. Measure of control. And shall seek your advice.
What did he say to Cain just there? Seek your advice. In other words, even though he's losing control of the newspapers, he is still given some input on how it is run. Are you following? Okay. Oh, doggone it.
Don't you think it's wrong?
Whoop.
Large measure of control. Measure of control. And shall seek your advice. This depression temporary.
This depression temporary. Which what would mean for Cain probably? He might be able to get it back. How is z-axis used in conjunction with the dialogue, and thus illustrating Cain's kind of inner turmoil, if you will? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, he's kind of like walking away as he's losing control, and then where the part comes where he starts to kind of like gain like a little bit of control, is handing back to me.
Exactly. So right here he says, we're bust. Starts walking towards the back. All right. like this, and he looks like a little kid. He's very, very small. Remember that first shot I showed you where he's back in the frame as a little kid? And who's in the foreground? His guardian. It is like he is back in the same position. That use of z-axis brings that relationship back. And they're kind of bantering back and forth. You know, oh, you're too old to be called anything else. You shouldn't be calling me this. As he comes back, he's still small. And he says, my allowance. Right? You give a child an allowance. And again, so it looks like Cain is not in the same position of power that, and if you were to watch the movie up to this point, he has been in a position of power. Right? And that's kind of why I included that previous scene, right? He's like, I will be here for 60 years. You know. But as he gets up here, the dialogue reveals that he's going to have some input, he's going to have some influence, maybe this depression will not last very long, etc. So, you see the connection there? Yes, Tori.
I'm a little confused between the difference of Y and Z.
Okay, because Y, Orson Welles is the actor. He is traveling in depth of field. That is back and forth, okay? So, if anything, he starts out going from the top of the screen to the bottom of the screen. That y-axis, the y that's considered y-axis, is the trains start at the bottom of the screen and they reach all the way to the top. So it's almost like you're traveling up the screen, not necessarily back into it. Oh. It's a subtlety. There's also xy-axis when you're traveling diagonally as well, but we're not going to get into that. We spent a lot of time on that, but these are the kinds of connections to perhaps be on the lookout for. All right. Let's go. Composition. We talked a little bit about this. This is another scene from Citizen Kane. This takes place after Charles Kane has died, which actually starts at the beginning of the movie. So the whole movie is a giant flashback, which is another technique. Okay. So they have just watched a documentary on Charles Kane's life. Okay, and so they're going to be discussing that, and they're kind of wondering, they're going to figure out how to create another story based off of that.
Hello. Stand by. I'll tell you if we want to run it again. Well, how about it, Mr. Walton?
How you like, boys?
Well, 70 years in a man's life.
That's a lot to try to get to a newsreel.
It's a good show, Thompson, but what it needs is an anchor.
Yeah.
All we saw on that screen was that Charles Foster Kane is dead. I know that. I read the paper. You see, Thompson, it isn't enough to tell us what a man did. You've got to tell us who he was. Needs that anchor. Wait a minute. What were Kane's last words? Do you remember, boys?
Yes, please.
What were the last words he said on Earth? Maybe he told us all about himself on his deathbed.
Yeah, maybe he didn't. Maybe it was...
All we saw on that screen was a big America.
A little bigger.
But how is he any different from Ford? Or hers, for that matter, or John Doe?
Yeah, sure.
I tell you, Thompson, a man's dying words.
Where are they? You don't read the papers.
When Charles Foster Kane died, he said just one word.
Rosebud.
Not only
Tough guy.
Yes, Rosebud.
Eyes calling
just
for
that
Rosebud.
one word. But who is she?
What was it?
Here's a man that could have been president, who was as loved and hated and as talked about as any man in our time. But when he comes to die, he's got something on his mind called Rosebud. Now, what's that mean?
A racehorse he bet on once. Yeah, that didn't come in.
All right. But what was the race?
Rosebud.
Thompson.
Yes, Mr.
Hold this picture up a week. 2 weeks ago.
What do you think right after his death?
Find out about Rosebud. Get in touch with everybody that ever knew him. Oh, knew him well. That manager of his, Bernstein. His second wife. She's still living.
Susan Alexander Kane.
Running a nightclub in Atlantic City.
Yeah, that's
See them all. Get in touch with everybody that ever worked for him. Whoever loved him. Whoever hated his guts. I don't mean go through the city directory, of course.
I'll get on it right away, Mr. Olson.
Good. Rosebud. Dead or alive. This will probably turn out to be a very simple thing.
Which it actually ends up being so. So directing the eye is a technique used by directors to emphasize what is important in the scene. All right, so it's does that make sense? So you don't want certain things to be a distraction. You want the audience to gravitate to a particular point or concept or something. So how is directing the eye used in this particular shot? Yes, Tori.
Like I thought it was super cool when he had his back to them, and then the light kind of like framed him.
Yes.
I thought that was really cool and showed that what he was saying was important.
And I've got a quirky thing here where I can't scroll back, so I'm sorry about that. Yeah, in terms of how the light's used. Yeah, light's huge in this scene, right? I mean, it really has a huge impact. What kind of impact does it have? Let me rephrase. What are they talking about? They're talking about Charles Kane's death, right? And remember, what did they just watch? A film about his life. And what did they say about the film afterwards? Yeah, well, I read the papers. All that film tells us is that he's dead. We need to find out more. Like, we want to make this an interesting story. All right? So good. So what else did they say they want to know? Rosebud. Right? Who is Rosebud? What is Rosebud? It was his last words. Okay? How does this lighting technique, which in turn is called directing the eye, bring that concept out? Who is in the dark? Everybody. The journalists, right? They're journalists. And so what are you kind of forced to focus on? And his idea, what they're saying. Like you know, if you were to cut to a different scene with one of them fully lit, you're probably not going to recognize them. But that does not really matter, because the whole point is more about Rosebud. What is Rosebud? It is about the riddle and what that all means. And that sets a tone for the rest of the movie. You're not distracted by the different people. Who's that guy? Have you ever gone to a movie? My wife is guilty of this, okay, where you're watching all the different characters and then you get confused who is who. And you're like, well, who's that guy? Was that guy in that other scene? I don't know. There's a whole Seinfeld sketch on it, okay? We'll be watching a movie and my wife will always ask me that. She says, I'm sorry, but who is that guy? You're not distracted by that with this. Everybody is in the dark, so you're focused on what is most important. That is good directing. Does that make sense? Okay. Next technique. Size. I'm just going to let it roll.
What are you doing? Jigsaw puzzles?
That's his wife, and they're in their mansion, which is not very big. That was a joke.
Charlie, what time is it?
11:30.
New York?
Hmm?
I said, what time is it in New York?
11:30.
Night?
Mm-hmm. Bulldog's just gone press.
Well, hooray for the Bulldog.
Gee, 11:30. Shows are just getting out. People are going to nightclubs and restaurants. Of course, we're different because we live in a palace.
You always said you wanted to live in a palace.
Oh, a person could go crazy in this dump. Nobody to talk to, nobody to have any fun with.
Susan.
49,000 acres of nothing but scenery and statues. I'm lonesome.
Till just yesterday, we've had no less than 50 of your friends at any one time. I think if you look carefully in the West Wing, Susan, you'll find about a dozen vacationers still in residence.
You make...
Okay. Dozen vacationers still, meaning at their place, which she doesn't realize that they're probably still there. All right. So how's size used? Makes everybody look small. Absolutely. Good.
Makes everything look super empty.
Makes everything super, and of course, it's not just one technique that makes a scene. What else is used in this scene that makes it kind of effective?
Sound.
The use of sound. How?
Just kind of echoing.
It's echoing, right? So all this size, what does that lead to a feeling of? Emptiness, which is exactly what they're talking about in the dialogue. I'm lonely. I don't know. This dump. All these things kind of bring that out even more strongly. Okay, so size can have that impact. It also can have another impact of just like sheer awe. Like if you look at Lord of the Rings and how size is used in that movie. Sometimes it's used to kind of set this amazing kind of context or set, if you will, for the story. So size is another thing. You'll see that in Singing in the Rain. They use size in different ways. Okay, so that's kind of like shot composition, film composition, framing, use of space. Editing, you can see a guy editing there. Okay, he's literally looking at the different frames and ready to kind of splice and cut and that sort of deal. All right, so editing obviously is very important, and I'm going to come back to this at the end. But editing has like 5 different elements of or principles. But again, how can editing help your understanding of a movie? Or how can it distract? I'm going to start calling on people. Someone who has not said anything yet. You read about this last week. You implemented it in your analysis. How is editing helpful, or how can it be distracting? Yes?
It can be helpful by putting it in like a logical order and making it continuous instead of jumping to like different parts.
Okay, so a smooth transition, which of course makes a film easier to understand. Yes?
There's too many cuts, and it's kind of
It can be totally distracting. I think action films today are kind of like to me, a good action film is one that still has a lot of cuts, but you still feel like you're in the flow of the action. I mean, there's some action movies I'm like, I'm bored because I know he's about to kill somebody, but we're jumping around too fast. I can't tell what is really going on. Okay, so editing is real key in terms of that. This is the opening to Citizen Kane. Okay, and this is a use of dissolve as an editing technique. Okay, so it's not just jumping from bit to bit. It kind of you see this dissolve going from element to element. I think the opening's interesting too, actually. Not this necessarily, but but like there's no sound, there's no soundtrack. And this is where we'll start to see the use of dissolves, as well as a bunch of other techniques. And this is Kane's estate. So just right there we use dissolve. You see the dissolve? Okay, what effect did that have? Yeah, the fence is really high. Okay, taking a long time to pan up the fence. Still going up the fence, or gate, if you will. All right, and how is dissolve used there? Right, you see it in the background. Good. I guess we'll just call it a castle. Castle in the background. The dissolve was fast or slow? Why is that important? Yeah, it's going on and on and on, right? And now you're starting to be introduced to that K obviously in the foreground. And it's this interesting mix of dark and light. Like it's supposed to be this, a massive, illustrious estate, but it's kind of creepy. At the same time, the K is really big and dominant, but it seems like a desolate place. Weird monkeys. mean, even just that shot, I know this isn't dissolved, but the reflection of it in the background upside down adds to the kind of the weirdness, and we'll see eventually the tragic situation. And of course, we're progressively getting slower. We dissolve to the golf course, par 4, 365. That's a big golf course. So you're getting a sense of how expansive, of course, this whole place is. So how's dissolve used there? The light. But you're now inside the house. Did you pick up on that?
Oh, no.
Yeah, watch. And again, this is one reason why the film's considered so good is
What? I saw it.
I can't tell if you're making fun of it or you're being serious.
I'm serious.
Yeah. And there's the famous Rosebud. Hey, Court. Anyway, we will pick up there. Obviously, you do not. We're pushing stuff back a day in terms of assignments. So, except for the reading, I still want the reading due. Actually, we're not moving back due dates. Yeah, it's still Wednesday. Yes.
So it's due on Thursday?
It's due Wednesday.
Okay. Where's the rest of my chair?
It's on the floor.